For the final talk of the conference, seems to be kind of a nice kind of wrapping up of everything we've been talking about and the different themes that have been kind of coming across is the idea of, documentation as product. And I'll go ahead and let Mark explain that. So.
Hello, everyone. Last talk of the conference. I hope the sugar from the cookies is still working for everyone. So, my name is Mark Tattersall. I'm going to be talking to you about documentation as a product. So what do I mean when I say documentation as a product? Well, the dictionary definition of a product is something that is the result of an action or process. So documentation clearly satisfies that criteria. But why do we never talk about documentation as a product? The answer I arrived at to that question is that documentation is so inextricably linked to that which is being documented. It's kind of simply overlooked as a product in its own right. So when I say documentation as a product, I think really it's fair to say that documentation is a product. Because in my experience, this is typically where write the docs kind of falls. It's often relegated to a line item on a project plan. You're building a feature or a product, and you get to that point where basically it's like, we need to write the docs so we can get this shipped. It's the last thing that people are thinking about. So my contention is that this is because documentation is typically characterized by tactical thinking. And that's not to say that tactical thinking is not important. It absolutely is. You need to consider and work through understanding who your audience is, the tone and voice of your content, and the content management system. However, what I'm going to do with my time here is to take a step back from the tactics a little bit and think more holistically about documentation. Because as we've established, documentation is a product, and so it deserves the product treatment. And thinking holistically about a product, as this definition says, means understanding something as intimately interconnected and explicable only by reference to the whole. So product thinking about docs as opposed to tactical thinking means thinking about the problem first before jumping to the ins and outs of delivering a solution. It means aligning your documentation along the broader vision for your product and company and understanding and meeting your users' needs. It also means thinking about how you measure success. And how do you know that your docs are satisfying those user needs and requirements? So even though I'm going to talk at that higher level and go through some higher level questions in thinking about documentation, I wanted to ground the talk in having some takeaways, something that you can apply to your work. So I have two objectives from this talk, and you can be the judge of whether or not I satisfy them. But firstly, I want to fully arm you to go write some killer docs. I want to outline a structure that enables you to understand the full complexity of a documentation product. And that should give you the ammunition for getting more time, more resources, or getting the funding to do a more holistic documentation product. And secondly, it might act as a heuristic for execution. I'm going to go through some broader product thinking, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about what to think about broader topics about execution as well. Not all of them will be applicable all the time, but it could act as a checklist for you to kind of think through your documentation products before kind of diving into the nitty-gritty. So a little bit about me before I get started. You're probably wondering, who am I to talk to you about this stuff? Well, I'm a product manager at Braintree. Braintree is a full stack payments provider for developers. So people can accept credit cards in their mobile devices and on the web. So as a product manager at a company where essentially our API is our product, documentation is really of critical importance. And my fascination with the documentation side of my role started at the very beginning. I joined Braintree about 2 years ago, and before I kind of got ramped up into a full project, I was doing, just like competitive analysis, looking around at who is our direct competitors and just kind of the general space. And it became very obvious to me that our documentation was sorely lacking. We didn't have get started guides, we didn't have tutorials. So I wrote them. I did a bunch of research, and that was the first thing I shipped at Braintree. And it was a wonderful experience. It got me really thinking about documentation a lot. I came to this conference last year, and I've kind of become the de facto docs guy at work. So anytime anyone wants to do anything with docs, they tend to go through me, which I really enjoy. But writing docs at Braintree is a highly complex task. We have client libraries in 7 server-side languages, 2 mobile SDKs, and a number of JavaScript libraries. So you're never writing anything once. There's a number of permutations you have to consider along the way, because one sentence and a snippet of code in Ruby can be 3 times that in Java. So you have to kind of think through that in detail and kind of lay it on top of our core payments APIs, a number of advanced products as well. And the documentation for that can get really, really difficult. And we think about documentation a lot in advance of launching products. We have a really tech-savvy, dev-centric customer base, and we often go to them to act as a beta in the beta program for when we're releasing something. And basically, they're often interested, they want to do it, but the first thing they ask is, where's the docs? What's this going to take me? What's the integration look like? So we're often writing the docs well in advance of having the product completed. And it's actually a really good exercise. So we're always thinking about that merchant integration experience, and we make sure that there's a simple line to integration there for both in our docs and in the code. And since the new year, I've been working on a new docs project. This is kind of a preview about what we're going to be launching very soon. I'm very excited about it. We kind of rethought our docs from the ground up, and that's going to be launching soon. So a lot of what I'm talking to you about, I actually have been going through myself and living for the last 3 or 4 months. So let's get going and do some product thinking about documentation. Unfortunately, I can't give you a bunch of definitive answers here. When I think product thinking is a lot about running through a series of questions to try and get at the only answers that apply to your particular documentation needs. But running through these questions, you should emerge at some kind of a framework that you can kind of hang your docs on going forward. And there'll be something you can keep, if you lay this foundation, it's something you can keep going back to as problems come up during the execution phase. So question 1, and this is the fundamental question for any product. What problems are the docs solving? If you can't understand specifically what problems your docs are solving, you have to kind of question what it is that you're doing in the first place, right? And it's a product or documentation, it's exactly the same. You need to understand the problems you're solving at the heart of what you're doing. So when I was thinking about this in terms of documentation, I was taking a step back and thinking about kind of broader trends at play in software. I think we're kind of in an age of like software as a service and open source and APIs. And very few software products stand truly alone anymore. They often exist in support of something, or they rely on other connections coming in. So software is an ecosystem, and you need to understand your product's place within that ecosystem. And your documentation plays a critical role in that. It needs to make that connection clear. It's not only this is how you do it, but why, and this is where you can go with it, and how it fits within the broader ecosystem. So in this age of software as a service and APIs and open source, I think your documentation needs to cater to 2 groups of people, both existing and potential users. I see this as a big shift historically from where documentation is normally targeted, because I think normally documentation is written for people who have already bought or signed up for whatever it is that they're going to be using. But I think nowadays there's a marketing aspect to docs, and actually somebody was mentioning this earlier today. Documentation can play a significant role in the sales cycle also, and that's definitely true at Braintree. It can be the shop window for your product. It's a way to grab people's attention, kind of present to them the core functionality or use case that your docs are solving, and kind of lures them in to learn more details. And by the same token, I think it's kind of like the packaging that people don't get to interact with anymore. I think, 8 years ago, I didn't do it myself, but you must have gone to buy software off a shelf at some point. You would have turned the box over and kind of read more details about on the back. And documentation kind of is, in many ways, the analog to that kind of turning over the box and kind of learning a few more details. So it's that next step in learning more about the product. So when I was thinking about this, I was reminded of an ad campaign in the UK many years ago, where they were trying to dissuade people from giving dogs and cats as presents at Christmas by saying that a dog isn't for Christmas, a dog is for life. And that kind of rang true a little bit with me with documentation. I'm not saying that docs would immediately remove all need for marketing. You're still going to need landing pages and all the other marketing functions that go on. But I also think people tend to switch off when they're being actively marketed to. And docs can be that next step in kind of delivering more information. So in many ways, your documentation could well be the first enduring interaction that your users have with your product. So on the flip side of that, I think the more traditional thought about what documentation is docs as a guide, a kind of companion through using your product. I think primarily users want documentation to be an instruction manual for learning how to use or get the most out of what it is that they just bought or signed up for. And fundamentally, they want it to act as a reference and index, a quick way for them to get the answer to the problem that they already know, and they know enough about your product to get to a specific search term or whatever it might be. So having thought about the kind of broader ways to think around what the core problem is that your product's solving and your docs are solving, we should think about who the users actually are. And we touched on this already. I've talked about potential and existing users. But I think that's really worth fleshing out in a lot more detail. And a common way to do this is with personas. I don't think you have to do this, but I think it can be a very good exercise. And we do it at Braintree a lot. A lot of our customer base is kind of wide-ranging from kind of solo developer entrepreneurs through to particular business functions at larger enterprises. So when we're writing documentation or we're building a product, we kind of shortcut to trying to look through their eyes and writing, more empathetically, by saying, hey, what would the dev think about this? Or what would the dev decider think about this? Or what would the business decider think about this? It's a way to just kind of shortcut through to that viewpoint onto your documentation, and it can be really effective. And to do a good job at that, I think you need to get out there and talk to your users. So do some user research, whatever you can do. And talk to other functions in your company, account management, sales, support. Understand anyone who's interacting with your user base, and understand what they're saying about your product and your service, and where your docs can do better. And this will kind of ensure that those personas that you're creating are kind of grounded in a reality. And when thinking about your users, keep reminding yourself you don't have a linear relationship with them. You're not going to get to just hold them by the hand from A to B. A significant portion of your users will kind of dip in and out of your docs at various times and at random intervals. Because at the end of the day, we have the web, and every page is a link, and that can get shared wherever. So people will kind of choose their own path through. And that's an important thing to keep thinking about, because your docs will take on a life of their own once they're out there, and users will find their way there from a number of different sources. So always ask yourself the question, will the personas that you create understand where they are and what they're seeing after clicking on a link that they were sent on Twitter? This is just a great way to keep grounding your docs in solving that core problem and making it obvious to users where they are and what they're seeing. So now, as you start to get a grasp on who these people are and what problems they're solving and what problems you're solving, you can start to build out a structure for how to communicate with them. Again, this is not a docs-only decision. You need to put this in the context of the company and the product set, and think about how your company and your product talks to your users already. Is it chatty or formal? Is humor used? Does the product emphasize simplicity and kind of getting started quickly, or does it really emphasize the depth and power of the features that are available? Because this needs to shine through in your docs as well. And again, at Braintree, we have to think about this a lot as well. We like to talk with a human touch, but we're dealing with money, so we also need to sound like we know what we're doing. So it's walking that fine line, and that needs to be in the docs as well as it is anywhere else on the site. Because this is a critical aspect to get right, because your users will have an enduring relationship with your docs. It will be something that they'll go back to again and again, most likely. So you want to establish that first impression and make sure it's an authentic message that's from the home page all the way through to Z in your reference. So you now also need to expand out to the future and consider where your docs fit in the grand scheme of things. This can be difficult. Not everyone has access to the vision for the company or the roadmaps. It depends on how free this information is shared at your company. But find out what you can, get access to roadmaps, chase down people who are involved in that meeting, and just try and get a sense about where things are going, as well as do your own research in the area, in the marketplace that your company and product exists. Because if a big change is coming, you want to know about that. You want to make sure that your docs are able to handle those changes as they come. And make sure that you position the core message at the middle of your docs. Going back to that idea of not having a linear relationship with your users, you need to establish what the core message is of what you're documenting, and make sure that people can always orient themselves around that within the broader scope of both the product you're documenting and the company beyond that. So they're kind of like the fundamental questions to start thinking about your docs in a broader way. And there are two final questions to think about before kind of diving into execution in my mind. The first one is, what does success look like? There are two sides to this coin. Firstly, from the user's perspective, are they getting what they want? Are they solving those problems? Are they getting the questions answered that they need? So do your research again. Find out user support tickets that somebody was mentioning earlier today. Find out what the common complaints are and issues. If you can, do a survey. Net Promoter Score is a great one. The guys from Twitter were mentioning yesterday. You're just trying to get to a baseline. You're trying to understand, what does it look like now? So when I release my new version of the docs, is that going to move the needle in the right direction? And then the other side of the coin is the more selfish point of view is, like, are the docs furthering your company and product goals? And what are the success factors for that? So this is where you want to start thinking about kind of getting your kind of metrics and analytics together and thinking about, are there calls to action in the docs that I should be tracking? Are there engagement metrics? So again, you might want to kind of like start talking to marketing and other functions in your company to understand what they do, because you might be able to apply a lot of the same things to your technical docs. And this is particularly kind of a critical step when you made that shift to thinking about docs as part of the marketing sales cycle as well, because if you are making sales and you are causing people to sign up, you want to track it. You want to know how many, because this data is going to be critical to you in kind of getting future funding and doing future iterations and keeping that feedback loop with the docs going, so it's always top of mind. And then the very final last step is do some competitive analysis. It's a kind of a critical part to a product management function, and I think it really helps in documentation also. Learn from those around you and from different fields. Just kind of get plugged into places where people are talking about docs. Coming to a docs conference is a good start. and then just kind of and pulling that back in with everything else that you've answered about your documentation. Going back to when I first wrote the guides at Braintree when I first joined, I did a lot of this competitive analysis, not only of direct competitors to Braintree, just broadly, what's good API documentation look like? It really helped me solidify. I knew I needed to add these certain things to the guides I was writing. And then I actually wrote a blog post to kind of publish back, this is what I learned, this is what I think the core trends are. And it was great. I got introduced to a bunch of people. I got a lot of good, it got a lot of traffic there when it was released. It was a very kind of, it was a great experience. And it was part of what got me into kind of continuing to think about documentation. So do the research, absorb what you've learned, and then do different and do better. I love this diagram. It's from the cartoonist Hugh MacLeod, and it kind of perfectly explains what I think this last step is all about. Because if you've answered all those core questions about your product, and then you start looking at the broader, what your competitors are doing, what are the good examples of documentation are, you start to get to make connections that only you can make, that only because of your knowledge, your expertise, everything you've answered about your particular product and users enables you to make new connections that are unique to you. So I think this is kind of a critical last step to kind of helping make those new connections. So that was kind of the product thinking part of my talk. I'm now just kind of dive into a little bit about more of that kind of checklist I was mentioning at the beginning about execution, something to kind of like walk through when you're working on a docs project. So two fundamentals that apply to any documentation project. Firstly, information architecture. Before diving into anything else, map out how everything will fit together, understand your content, and keep referring back to the core questions we answered earlier. What problems are you solving for your users? What's the core message of your product and company? And let your answers guide your IA, because if your IA doesn't address these questions, your content is immediately at a disadvantage. And secondly, regardless of whether you think all of your users are going to read it on the laptop, please make it responsive if you're going to do a docs project. As I mentioned before, docs will take on a life of their own once they're published. So make sure that the person who's clicking on a link on their phone can get access to the content in the same way as if they were on their laptop. So let's talk about the different formats that documentation can come in, that you can think about when you're executing on a new documentation project. And actually, I think it was Nina yesterday had an awesome slide with the different formats of documentation. That was really awesome. And way better than what I've got. So, so go back to her slides. But as a quick guide, like quick starts and tutorials are great. The kind of guided path through certain aspects of your product are really, really useful, and it's just a super effective way of getting people to use your product. We have like 3 core ones at Braintree, and then we write them for every new product that we release. It's just kind of the best way to get that kind of like so users can just see what it takes to get going with the new release. Interactive sessions are another documentation format that I think is really worth considering, and it may not be something that's immediately thought of as part of documentation, but allowing a user to interact in a console and see what a call and response looks like, and what is a really good way to kind of ramp up that engagement with your users and kind of get that immediate feedback. And we've heard that a few times in a few other talks also. So it may not be documentation, the console itself might not be documentation per se, but where you position it, what's wrapped around it, how you deliver the results, it's documentation. It's communicating to your users, and it can be a really useful tool in your arsenal when you're working on your docs. And example applications and test environments, kind of along the same lines as interactive sessions, but some users don't want hand-holding, particularly in our space, like developers. A lot of them want to dive in, kind of make mistakes, download sample apps, and kind of reverse engineer their way back out from something that works. Again, kind of that non-linear relationship. So cater to this use case and make sure that sample apps are available and test environments, and they're well documented and easy to find. And this is actually a screenshot from Braintree's GitHub repo, because the code itself is documentation. So use it freely. If there's comments in the code that are kind of publicly readable for consumption as well, then even better. Kenneth Wright, actually last year, who talked this year, yesterday, he advocated for Readme-driven development, which is kind of like, write the Readme before you've even written the code. And this is something we occasionally actually do at Braintree as well. It's a really good way to just zero in and focus on what it is that you're delivering before you kind of dive into the code. So the Readme, keep thinking about your Readmes as well. Whatever's posted to GitHub, it's documentation, and you want to absorb it and make it as valuable as possible. And finally, the reference, the index to your docs. Give the users the ability to both search and browse. People want the opportunity to do both. So make sure you're accommodating for that. So there are the different formats to consider. There's also the community aspect of your docs also. And I've mentioned this a couple of times, but you want to encourage your docs to have a life outside of your environment. If you can allow comments maybe directly on your site, that's something to consider. That can be a moderation nightmare, or maybe it's just not where you want that to be happening. But at the very least, like, make sure your URLs are readable, semantically accurate, and people can orient themselves. If they share a link on Stack Overflow or wherever it might be, they understand where it is it's going to lead them. And support documentation I've put in this heading also. And it may go by different names. I think what I'm saying here is, like, reference any other user-facing documentation that might be out there. The example I was thinking about at Braintree was we have the developer docs and the support articles, and the support articles did a great job at referring back to the dev docs. But we never really repaid the compliment. We never kind of like, hey, there's also a support article that might be along the same lines of what you're looking for. So make sure to do that. Make sure you're linking to all the content that's out there that's relevant. Because if you've got a business user who's looking to refund a transaction and he's staring at an API when really he wants to find that button in the UI, then your docs are failing if he can't find what he needs. So onto content management. It's kind of a hot button topic in documentation, I would say, at least when I first started thinking about docs. It's immediately where my head went to. But there's a reason I kind of left it to the end here, because I think your CMS choice should come at the end also, after you've done all of this preliminary thinking. Make sure every question that we've answered before, every format that you've considered can be accommodated by the CMS, and that your CMS isn't kind of dictating back to you. But when you're kind of getting into that decision, think about your formats. Think about the writers. Are they internal, external? What kind of access do they need? What's their technical proficiency level? Like, do they need like a Word UI type, a Word style UI, or is text files okay? I was going to go on a little bit of a rant here about using Markdown and Git, but it seems kind of redundant now, so I'll just say +1 to the guy before. And analytics. Be sure to include analytics in your docs, because as I mentioned before, you need to measure your success. You want to know what paths your users are treading through your docs. What are they searching for? Which sample apps are they downloading? Which tutorials are the most viewed? Try and get some automated reports on this. Because at the end of the day, data is power. And like every good product, you will need to launch quickly and minimally, and then iterate fast. And data is kind of an integral part to being able to do that well. So I'll kind of end there. I've covered a hell of a lot, I know. But there's a lot to think about when building a product. And that's kind of fundamentally the point that I'm making. Treat your docs as a product. Think about them holistically before narrowing down to the tactics of implementation, and then be prepared to iterate and adjust just as you would with a product. So thank you very much.
All right, we have time for a couple questions, if anyone.
Could you elaborate a bit on your concept of interactive sessions? Are you talking VMs, some sort of REST client console, or what?
Yeah. I mean, it depends on your product, but yeah, REST client, REST API console. I put up a screenshot there of like try Ruby. You see it a lot in learning, programming languages where you can just kind of get going in the browser as opposed to kind of getting an environment going locally. It can just be a really good way, particularly in those like kind of getting started kind of phases of your docs where you can just show your user like, hey, this is what you can do, this is how easy it is, and now this is how we're going to show you how to do it yourself. It's just a very good introductory tool, and like I say, it just ramps up the engagement with your users, kind of keeps their interest. They kind of know what they're aiming for immediately. They're already seeing the result. Just like the hello world that the guy from Google was saying earlier, the quickest way to get to hello world so that they understand what they're doing.
Cool. All right, well, thank you.